Hello. So I'm Meg Bolger from Facilitator Cards, and I have a few questions that came up in a session that I was leading recently and that didn't get answered in the session. So I'm going to read those out to you today. I'm going to answer them best I can, and let's jump straight into it. So first question. How do you create an environment where participants interact with each other rather than the facilitators? Okay, so how do you create an environment where the participants interact with each other instead of the facilitators? So I think there's a couple of different things that we can do as facilitators that can set people up to interact with each other. One is really obvious, is we can remove ourselves from the situation, which often online means putting them into breakout groups or breakout rooms. In person, it means putting them into small groups, right? So as soon as we shrink the population of people that they have the option to deal with or to interact with to just each other, they're going to interact with just each other. So whether that's putting people in pairs, putting them in triads, putting them into small groups of 4 or 5, in breakout rooms or in person, that's the big and most obvious way that we can get them to interact with each other. And when we do that, I think that creates a really important dynamic where they are learning from each other and they're seeing each other ideally as sources of information, right? So it's important that when we put them in those groups, that there's some sort of that there's a meaningful interaction that's happening with them, that they're not just that they're generating information with each other in particular, or sharing or processing information with each other. And that can help kind of establish the people in this room are people you can learn from. So that's the first thing you can do. Change the group size and make it small enough that they are forced to interact with each other. Another thing is to make the norms as such that there is a way that people feel comfortable directly responding to each other rather than having to go through you. This is a little trickier online, I find, because there isn't as much freedom of movement. People have to mute and unmute. But there's a big difference between saying, okay, as a group, if somebody says something and you want to respond to it, go ahead and just unmute and go ahead and respond to them. We're going to assume everybody's in gallery view. We're going to assume, if people have their cameras on, it's going to be a little easier to cue, oh, this person's about to talk. Versus if you want to say something, put something in the chat or raise your hand and I will call on you. As soon as you establish that type of norm, people are less likely to be talking to each other and they're going to feel like every interaction is filtered through you. Now, that's something that I do a lot in my sessions. I have people raise their hands, or I have people I kind of call on them. But I do find that even though that norm works for a lot of what I do, it does reduce the amount that people are speaking directly to each other versus kind of feeling like they're speaking to me or to the group rather than kind of information going this way. So just be aware of those types of little subtle norms. You don't even have to do it explicitly, but if people do raise their digital hand or do, ask to speak and you call on them, that will create a kind of an implicit norm where people will be interacting with you rather than each other. Another thing you could do is, online, this would be very easy to have people put things in the chat and then have people either direct message respond to folks or just respond to something they saw in the chat earlier in the chat again. And just that idea of you're not the one sharing the information that they're interacting with is coming from each other. Those are some of the ways that you want to encourage people to interact with each other. I think that if you're finding yourself wanting to ask that, think about the structures that can help support that or make it easier rather than being come on guys, respond to each other. Instead, if someone says something and no one responds, you could say, okay, take 1 minute, write your response. Then I would love to get a couple of different ideas on the table, right? Create structures that can help them do that rather than hope they're going to do it. And then be cautious of the structures that limit that kind of freedom of response and connection. Yeah. Okay.